I'm Dr. Iyer. Well, I'm really glad to be here and to share this time with you and to talk about meditation as a healing practice. And one of the first questions I'm often asked is, why would I, as an internal medicine physician, get so interested in meditation, in particularly as it relates to healing? And I've thought a lot about this since I give a lot of these talks, and I think my answer is a little bit different every time because there are so many, you know how sometimes there are many vectors that line up to create change? And that's been this way for me in regards to meditation again and again and again. And I'd say that my first exposure to, first of all, meditation, guided imagery, there are a number of different words used to describe an overarching, huge umbrella of practices that in some manner work to affect the mind, to slow things down, and to wake up to what's going on inside. So it's a very introspective process, in contrast to the part of the mind which we're more familiar with, which is the cognitive, rational, linear, logical, rote memorization, which is what passes as education, by and large. I think I made it funny. And so the very first exposure I think that I had beyond the Eastern religion class I took in college, which was just all very superficial, reading about, was I was already in medicine. And Carl Simonton in the 80s had an interest in helping cancer patients with pain and insomnia and, some things that could perhaps be affected by deep relaxation techniques. And so he brought in people who were qualified to teach guided imagery for purposes of helping people relax and have a better quality of life, really, in the face of their cancer. And lo and behold, over time they started noticing that the individuals who were receiving these treatments were actually having better outcomes in other ways. And that was not anticipated. So they were having longer life, less side effects, and so on and so forth. And so that began a real interest for Dr. Simonton in the role of guided imagery on the immune system. And so he started a whole body of work around that. And I'd say the second vector that lined up is when I started my practice in internal medicine, got out of the hospital of the rigorous training, and was actually seeing people feet on the ground in the community. It didn't take me very long to figure out that those statistics were right. 85% of what I was seeing had to do with lifestyle choices. And that's a fact, that's a statistic. Chronic diseases, 85% or so, are moderated, modulated, and affected, or sometimes even caused, by lifestyle choices. And it didn't take me very long to figure out that most people knew the right answers to the questions. Is smoking good for you or bad for you? Is a full-fat diet good for you or bad for you? Bad. If on the label of what you're eating is a bunch of chemicals, fat and sugar, and yet the behavior was inconsistent with the obvious knowledge. So I got real curious about that gap, about that difference. And I do have a master's in psychology, so I was very interested in these are not clinically mentally ill people. These are all of us. And yet our choices. And so that difference between what we know and how we behave is a point of fascination for me. So I'd say in the late 80s, I thought I coined the word mind-body medicine. Turns out other people were using that word, but to me that's where the money is, the interest is, and where the difference is made. Another vector when I was in training, I learned about two main parts of the nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic system, I was taught, is under cognitive control. I want to move my hand, and I do. Sometimes my hand moves without my wanting it to do anything, but theoretically, that's sympathetic nervous system control. And then there's a whole part of the body that's under parasympathetic nervous control, and fortunately, you don't have to think about it. So your heart beats without your telling it to, and so on and so forth. Breath is under both, which is interesting. And so I was taught that the parasympathetic control you have no control over at all. Parasympathetic nervous system you have no control over at all. Well, it turns out that that's just true about the cognitive linear left brain function, which we normally define as mental process. There is another part of the brain that when we access, in fact, you can reduce your blood pressure, slow your heart rate, and so on. But it isn't the part of the brain that you can say, okay, heart, slow down. It doesn't work like that. But if you learn to relax deeply into what is a meditative state, you can calm the inner self down. It also turned out, and this is very interesting, that the part of the brain that functions to run that behavior that seems so inconsistent to what we know better is also in that part. So it's a whole wealth of information that we have access to, but not with a pickaxe. And so I've been training in different types of meditation. I think I wrote in the bio like since the early 80s, but actually it's been since the late 70s. I remembered my very first meditation teacher. And so what I'm planning to do today is to talk about different types of meditation as they come from different cultures, because that defines a different focus and a different purpose, if you will. And the three main categories will be the Buddhist, which are probably the best known for their meditation, the Christian, which is more recent but extremely powerful, and the third will be the medical impact of guided imagery, which has been a particular interest and area of study for me for decades. So I'm going to do all that in the next 50 minutes. All right, so the first large area that I'd like to discuss is Buddhism. And that all by itself is an enormous topic, because there are many types of Buddhism, just like there are many types of Christianity. So let me just, how many of you have meditated or done centering prayer or guided image? Oh gosh, I'm singing to the choir. Okay, well, in Buddhism, meditation first began after the death of the Buddha. The first branch of Buddhism, the first major branch of Buddhism, is known as Theravada or Hinayana, and that came out of Burma. And the type of meditation for which that school is best known is Vipassana. That's also known as insight or mindfulness meditation. Most people know those terms. And as a practice, there are two main components. The first thing that is taught is concentration, and the method whereby the mind is trained to concentrate typically is to notice the breath. And when I first trained in this with Goenkaji, he was very strict. You just noticed where the breath touched the nose as it came in and came out. This meditation is done with the eyes closed. And I challenge you, if you think that that sounds easy, to go home, set your timer for 5 minutes, focus on the feeling of the breath on the tip of your nose, and start counting how many times you catch your mind on some other topic. I challenge you. So most of us have not learned to concentrate the mind in such a focused way. The mind is a crazy monkey. And so that's the first thing, is to practice. And in the 12-day retreats, the first 3 days were devoted from 4 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. on just that. Just that. And then you move to the insight portion of the meditation, which is typically done by noticing in a scanning fashion what sensations are going on in your body from head to toe. And most of us, again, are not terribly aware of the sensations of the body. I mean, are you aware of the sensation of where your body is meeting the chair right now? Can you feel it? Can you feel your feet? Can you feel your fingers? Notice, notice. And in Asian tradition, there's not a separate word for emotions. Emotions are recognized by the physical sensations in the body. So that's part of what you're noticing, is the emotions by the physical sensations. And then you start to notice your thoughts. And that's a tricky monkey right there. Noticing. Noticing, noticing. I'm listening and I'm also thinking about, and I'm being reminded about. And I wonder if I took the chicken out to thaw and and she reminds me of, and I wish that person over there would stop, and all this can happen in a mere 3 seconds. I mean, we have layered thoughts on layer, and so you start to notice. Now, the most common thing when I was teaching meditation as a formal class, the most common thing that I heard is, Dr. Wallace, that was my name back then, I can't meditate, my mind is too busy. Well, our mind is always busy, but the first thing we notice when we start to meditate is how busy our mind is. That's not a failure, that's a success. That's the beginning of the process of noticing what's going on in there. We're all kind of crazy people. And normally our frontal lobe works well enough, we can keep it hidden. But if only everybody really knew what we were thinking all the time. So and then coupled with that then are the principles of what's known as anicca and anatta. And what that means is the law of impermanence. So what one begins to notice is that the sensations that arise and the thoughts that arise come and they go. That's anicca. And anatta, they are not who you are. This is not who you really are. And so Buddhism, by and large, is, I call it a psycho-spirituality. Actually, I'll say more about that in a little bit. But they really come at things by negation. So you notice this, and you see that is not it. You notice it, and by the process of elimination, you center down into an awareness that is not definable by words, basically, which is why they use the process of negation. The Bon Dzogchen tradition, which comes from Tibet and is more ancient than Buddhism, to me, most perfectly describes where you end up. And again, the words are not going to do it justice, and that is the perfection of stillness of body, silence of speech, and spaciousness of mind. And so in Buddhism, there is not a description of deity. When I get to Christian meditation, I'll talk about that as a major difference. But there's a description, so that's why I call it psycho-spirituality. There's a description of how we cause ourselves suffering, dukkha, by our own mind. There is that which happens, and then there's the train that's on a loop that keeps us convinced. 5 days after the event, we're still in torture. You know, I was in primary care doing internal medicine in Oregon when 9/11 happened. And I started seeing all of these, just a deluge of patients coming in with clearly stress-related illnesses, just through the roof. And I finally figured out that people couldn't turn the dadgum TV off. And so they were watching the rerun of those planes crashing it again and again, and their brain wouldn't stop, and they were causing themselves to become stress-related sick. Now, we all do that in one degree or another. You know, somebody did something that was not okay, and we can't let it go. I'll be talking more about that topic also, because that's a real health-related issue. Okay, the second turning of the wheel and the second school of Buddhism is Mahayana, which is also known as the Great Vehicle. And there are many, 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 many subsets of this. By then, Buddhism was entering many different countries, and every country that it entered, it kind of insinuated itself into that country and that way of being. So one of the more commonly known, I think, is Zen Buddhism, which came from Japan. There are several in Tibet, Nyingma, Kagyu, several. And in general, the form of meditation in Zen in particular is just sitting, usually sitting facing a blank wall. And in this meditation, the eyes are slightly open and directed down. And the point is simply to notice what is. Again and again, come back to what is, to what is, what is. It's something you can do in daily life. What is, what is. And there are a number of things that are well known in the Mahayana tradition. The koan, for example. Have any of you heard of koan? You know what that is? It's a riddle that can't really be answered, and the idea is to stop the mind and bring you back. And there are many examples. Probably the most famous that I know of is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? If you get an answer to that, I want to hear it. The answer comes from a place of the brain that we're less familiar with, and that's the whole point. Many practitioners or monks in the Mahayana tradition take a bodhisattva vow, which is a vow, of course they believe in reincarnation, and it's a vow that they will stay present on the earth and try to assist humanity until all beings are enlightened. So it's sort of the ultimate in the compassionate heart. So the Heart Sutra, a talk that the Buddha gave at Deer something or other, Deer someplace, is cited frequently in the Mahayana tradition. There's a meditation known as Tonglen. Have any of you heard Tonglen? Which is designed to open the compassionate heart. And in this tradition, in this meditation, one either recognizes or imagines a suffering and imagines bringing that suffering in on the in-breath and on the out-breath, wishing the healing, the warmth, the compassion, whatever is needed to help this person or this country that is suffering. And so it's kind of the ultimate in the bodhisattva vow, to be available only to help, only to serve. And so Mahayana, the Great Vehicle. And so the meditations are of that sort. A third branch of Buddhist meditation comes from the Vajrayana tradition, that's also known as Tantra. And the basic notion here is that one works with the energy of the moment as it is. And so these monks are very warrior-like, they're very no-nonsense, and they're sometimes a little bit crazy. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was a Vajrayana practitioner, monk. And they use Tantra, Mantra, and Yantra. So Tantra being working with the energy as it is, Mantra being reciting a word or a phrase, Om Mani Padme Hum, such. And Yantra is imagining a face of the Buddha and a quality and imagining it, bringing it into oneself. So imagining the compassionate Buddha and imagining bringing that quality into oneself. So those are the main characteristics of the type of meditation done. It's very stylized. It's strongly recommended not even to try to do that without a teacher. Pause here and see if there are any questions, comments. Some of you clearly already have experience with this, so you might have added things to say. I welcome that. Any questions or comments on this portion?
I just want to say I have studied yoga for over 20 years, and my teacher brings in a lot of these concepts with her yoga practice.
Yes, thank you. Well, the Buddha, of course, came from India, and so there are forms of meditation that come even older than the Buddha. And so yoga is from the Indian culture, and yeah, it's interesting. Yoga is very designed for healing. It's a very helping you stay healthy in mind, body, and spirit. And meditation is designed really to cut through the crap of the mind, to wake up, to wake up, to wake up. The goal of Buddhist meditation is to awaken, meaning to awaken from our own mental folly, really. Yeah, so, yeah, a lot of people have been exposed to a lot of these things, I know. Any other comments or questions or things that people want to say? Did you have something that you wanted to say?
Where does
Transcendental meditation come in this? Yes, let me. So transcendental meditation came to the United States. Maharishi Yogi wanted to introduce a form of meditation that was understandable to Westerners. And so he started a school in California. And the entire focus really is on mantra. And actually it's been studied a fair amount by the scientific community because he very specifically wanted to introduce it to the Western culture. And I think it was 1958 actually, so it's more recent. And he explicitly wanted to introduce some form of meditation to the Western mind such that they could understand it. So it's very basic, it's mantra-based, and the notion is to calm, to soothe, to get the mind off of the discursive thought by coming back to a mantra. And so it's fairly basic, but it's also been well studied and successfully. It has been successful in calming all sorts of afflictive mental conflagrations. Okay, any other questions about the Buddhist background? Okay, so I want to talk about the Christian form of meditation, which is in some ways more recent but also very ancient. Father Thomas Keating wrote the primer on this, in my opinion, Open Mind, Open Heart. I highly recommend that if you have not read it. And he and others were noticing in the 70s, early 70s and 80s, 70s I guess, that they were losing a lot of their young people to these Eastern religions because it looked like they must have been giving them something that somehow they were no longer getting from their Christian faith, and they were quite concerned about that. And so they got their heads together and they said, you know, we've had meditative, contemplative traditions since the beginning of the church, but it's been in the cloisters, you know, in the abbeys and the convents and the monasteries and the desert. That's right, the desert fathers, exactly. And mothers. Thank you. Yes, and so they devised a format that they considered appropriate for the lay public And how many of you have done centering prayer? Sounds like a lot of you are already familiar with this. So centering prayer, which if you keep at it long enough becomes contemplative prayer, is what they put together. And this is really quite extraordinary. And it sounds a lot like Vipassana with some major differences. And so the notion of centering prayer is designed to reflect the knowing that in the silence is God present. In the silence is the divine. And the divine is always present, but in the silence we can hear the divine. So the main difference between Buddhist meditation and Christian meditation is the recognition of deity, non-theistic, not atheistic, non-theistic, there's no conversation about it, and a recognition. So there is a use of a sacred word, but it's different than mantra. So mantra in the Buddhist tradition is a concentration on the word. The sacred word in centering prayer, I like to think of it as like a turnstile. So here you are focusing on the inner silence, your breath, coming down to the deep quiet, with the full intention of that being an invitation for the divine to be present. And then your brain is off, being upset about what the neighbor did last week, or this, or that, or the other, or what you wish you had remembered to blah, 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 blah. The sacred word, and it can be anything. It can be amen, it can be Jesus, it can be Mary. It can be any word that you can remember. But it serves to get your brain back so that you can sink down. There's nothing particularly magic about the word, in other words. You're not concentrating on the word. You're using the word to rope yourself back so that you can dump back into the silence. Do you all see that difference? Yeah. So the point is to enter the silence to allow for the presence of the divine. And when one does that over a period of time, the point is not to have a sacred experience, although that can happen. The point is not to deeply relax, although that can happen. The point is to integrate the divine presence into your daily life. And so it is said that you notice the fruits of centering prayer by the changes in your life. And typically they're shorter. I mean, the Vipassana meditation that I was telling you about, we do long days of full meditation. And with centering prayer, I recently did a 4-day centering prayer retreat. And even there, it's 20 minutes of meditation and then moving, and then 20 minutes of meditation and moving, and so on, with the notion being that it's about integration into your life. And so the point is to invite the divine. It's a form of surrendering to the will of God, basically, by stopping our arguments, which sounds like, well, if I had only, dear God, please take over, and could you take care of this? I can tell you exactly how it should be done. Oh my gosh, we're funny, aren't we? Okay, any comments, notions? Some of you have had experience with this. Anything to add about centering prayer? No? Okay, the book again, Father Thomas Keating, Open Mind, Open Heart. Yeah. And there are others that have been written as well, but I still feel like that's the best. Okay, so the third main category of meditation that I want to talk about, and it's more aptly called guided imagery, has to do with the effects on our health and well-being. And I mentioned Carl Simonton. A more recent researcher is John Kabat-Zinn in Massachusetts. And he's been studying actually insight meditation for its impact on a huge variety of things. And almost everything he looks at, it clearly has made a difference in what he looks at. All stress-related illnesses are impacted for the positive. Pain reduction. And so there's been an ever-growing body of research looking at different types, and you mentioned transcendental meditation. That's been researched for a long time. They at one point brought a group of long-time practicing monks into the laboratory and hooked up their brain to measure PET scans and EEGs and so on and so forth, and noticed that in response to stimuli, that part of the brain would fire, but would immediately calm down, unlike the standard brain, where it would just keep going for a while. And so clearly meditation over time has an impact on our mental function and therefore our biological function. So sometime after I started training, there came about a field in study called psychoneural immunology. And there's been a robust, we now know it's a matter of course that the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is a real thing. If you're under stress, the catecholamines that are pumped out, which are directly impacting your heart rate and blood pressure, and furthermore, it affects your immune system. There are actually receptors on white blood cells for what used to be thought of as neurochemicals. So this whole body of research has exploded in the last, I'd say, couple of decades. And so the recognition of the importance of being able to calm this instrument down a little bit has an enormous impact. In fact, this almost sounds like common sense, doesn't it? Everybody's nodding. It's like, yeah, duh. But now there's research to support what we all know must surely be true. There's a number of years ago, I was asked to give a talk in Oregon to a group of cardiologists on the role of emotion in heart disease. And I thought, gosh, that's interesting. So I did a literature review so that I could come prepared with data. And I was shocked to find that in the 80s there had been done, do y'all know what beta blockers are? Yeah. At this stage of our life, we all know what a beta blocker is. Well, the seminal trials that were done back in the 80s, whereby giving beta blockers became the standard of care for those of us in medicine because of the robust evidence that it helps people who've had a heart attack, myocardial infarction. To my amazement, because I was never taught this, there were other arms to that research. Any of you who have research background know that typically more than one thing is looked at over the course of time. And there were two arms in particular that had a higher chi-square significance than did the beta blockers. Number one was the presence or absence of social support, so social isolation. And it's interesting, CDC recently has come out with a statement that there is currently an epidemic of loneliness. Have you all heard that? Yeah. And it has a higher impact on heart disease than does blood pressure or obesity. Yeah. Well, those studies back in the 80s would have already told us that. But, as an internal medicine doc, what the heck do you do with that information? You try to plug people in. It's like, go to church, would you? Join a CCRC. You know what? That's the other thing. The data show that people who join these places, you all know this, you all live longer than people who don't, and healthier. Yeah, you're in a good place. So the other arm was a thing that some of the researchers called held in hostility. Right, I said the same thing. Held in, you can kind of sense what that means, held in hostility. And I thought, what do you do with that? And it had a really high chi-square significance. Well, it just so happened that at that time I was on an interfaith council and was doing some talks, and we were looking at different things in the communities. And I had just recently, it had just come to me that there's one prayer that is the same in all Christian traditions. You know what it is? The Lord's Prayer. And it's like, now that's interesting. So I went at that with a scalpel, dissected it, and very carefully, it's like, this is interesting, this is really significant. And it came to me, there's one phrase in there that tells us what we need to be doing. You know that expression, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others. That's a statement of, I need to be doing something here. And then it came to vectors lining up. This was an explosion. My God, that's the answer to that held in hostility. We have the answer right here to the number one cause of morbidity and mortality in the United States of America. In fact, right now I think it's really important, don't you? It's there. So that got me going on a many year course that I'm still working on. Somebody asked me the other day to give a talk on forgiveness because I'm an expert. It's like, we teach what we need to know. And, right? And so I really have given it a lot of thought. And so I have done workshops on forgiveness, and I created a CD on forgiveness I'm also going to give you, because here's the thing about forgiveness. It doesn't look like this. I forgive you. However it comes out, it just doesn't look like that. It's an inside job, which is why it's so effective, because we remove the armor from around our own heart. We have to let ourselves soften inside and find a place where we can authentically wish for the well-being of whomever we're pretty sure is screwed up. They need it the most, right? No, wait, I don't know if that, I think I better go back to the laboratory. Right. So this is the purview of guided imagery. So, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And so in my imagination, by going into a deeply guided imagery, you can invite the horse to take that first sip. And that's all we can do. We can just actually mean it with the fullest intention and then go as far as we can. Discovered that oftentimes that's needed before you can get to forgiveness. There's a need to heal a wound often. So forgiveness absolutely needs to not be misconstrued as, you were right, I was wrong, or you're off the hook, or there are no consequences. It's none of those things. It's a removing the barb from our own heart. I mean, I thought about this, a particular person that I really had been feeling hurt about for years and years and years. I realized, you know what? She probably is not thinking about me at all. And she certainly doesn't know that I'm suffering like this. And the only person I'm poisoning right now is me. Yes. So, but I had to work on healing a space inside of me before I could get to an authenticity of simply wishing her well. Questions?
You haven't talked about forgiveness of self.
Thank you. Every talk I've ever given, this comes up. And it's interesting, I always forget it. So the comment was, you haven't talked about forgiveness of self. Boy, that's huge. And so when it's interesting, isn't it? It's almost like there was a form of therapy in the 80s that came about called Gestalt therapy. You familiar with that? Gestalt therapy, you take a part of yourself and put it in a chair, and you sit in this chair and you talk to that part of yourself, and then you sit and you talk back, because it is as if we have different parts of ourselves in our own brain. And you know what I mean. If you've ever done something and then later you're saying, oh, for God's sake, why did you say that? Who are you talking to in there? Now that's hard to get away from. That's the definition of misery. Because we are stuck in our own head with our own self. And so when we find a space to be gentle with that precious person who has gone through the life that we have, has the scars that we have, has the pains that we have that nobody else knows. When we can find a place to put our hand in our own heart and say, sweetheart, I love you. I am with you. This is a powerful exercise, by the way, and I encourage it. Some mornings I wake up and I do this before I get out of bed. If we don't line up our own energies in accordance with ourselves, to support ourselves to be the best that we can, our life will be over. And who else would have lived it? Who else could have filled the shoes? Who else could have done what we were asked and invited to do by being born into the unique body, mind, family, difficulties? It's the most important thing. It's the most important thing. And maybe that's why it's so hard. So, the thing about meditation is recognizing that the neuronal grooves that we have forged by our repeated statements are just that. They're grooves worn into the record. And so it does take effort, discipline, mindfulness, dedication, and a willingness. This is why I think involving the deity is so important. A willingness to turn it over, to surrender, to ask for help, all of those things. Questions? But yeah. Mm-hmm.
What is your daily meditative practice?
I do what I call a combination of Vipassana and centering prayer, because I practiced Vipassana in a fairly dedicated way for probably 15 or 20 years. And I never could call myself a Buddhist because I am not non-theistic. But I was one of those back in the 70s and 80s for whom the church was not, I have nothing against prayer unto itself, but I wanted to do the self-examination. It seemed like that was so important. But then when I started doing centering prayer, I realized, okay, this deep silence that I was entering, allowing the invitation. And I have to say I was doing that before I was exposed to centering prayer, just because that's what happens if you're aware of a divine. If you're quiet enough, the divine shows up. And but then when I heard there was a thing called centering prayer, that was kind of a relief. It's like I'm not all by myself in this. And so in the morning, during the week, my husband and I do 30 to 40 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes or so in the evening before bed. And on Sundays, at least an hour. And every few weeks, we have a morning of silence where it's complete meditation and bathroom breaks. And then we decide who's going to make lunch before we start. And once or twice a year, we do a full day of silence. And it's quite lovely. And as I say, I periodically go on retreats. So I just recently went on a 4-day centering prayer retreat. Did that answer your question? It's hard to, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah.
Well, that issue of why did I do that, I find that a helpful way of dealing with that is to not say, oh my God, but to say, what's going on? What caused that? The questioning,
Yes.
rather than
A fine distinction. Yes, for us to ask the question and really mean the question in the way of wanting an answer is very fruitful, because it's an objective question then. It's a question of what could I have learned from this, what do I need to see, and how can I be better? And I think probably that was the origin of the whole thing. But then what can happen for some people is there's a loop that gets started where it becomes a punishment, such that they're driven down, we are driven down into the ground, such that we become dysfunctional in our capacity to even respond.